Hi again then guys, and welcome to a review of a car which we've technically covered before, not just in GT Sport but in GT6 as well, but it was the older version. I actually prefer the older version of this car, the pre-facelift, and that car is obviously the Peugeot RCZ, a car which falls into some pretty good categories in terms of its usability. It is of course a sports coupe which can legitimately take on stuff like the Audi TT in some forms at least, but at the same time it also crosses over into the front wheel drive camp, which the TT of course doesn't so much these days, especially in Gran Turismo Sport, because the only front wheel drive version of that car is of course the race car, the Cup. This one though is obviously a street car. The classification is fairly low because it's only got 152 horsepower to begin with, so it's not quite as powerful as it might look. That could seem maybe a bit disappointing given that it's a pretty flash looking car. I've always liked the design of the RCZ myself, especially the double bubble rear window. I think that looks gorgeous on pretty much any car that has it, and I've always liked it a lot more actually than the Audi TT. Because with the Audi, I guess I just kind of got used to it and then got over it, whereas with the Peugeot it's fresher, newer, a little bit more oddball, I guess you could say, in comparison. But naturally, of course, the question arises of how useful is this car? Because in Gran Turismo 6, the RCZ was pretty good, especially in terms of being a front-wheel drive car, but it didn't tend to get a huge amount of use by the community. So has that changed? Should that change? And how does this one compare to that one? Because in Gran Turismo 6, the Peugeot could be tuned up to about 460-ish horsepower, and it could do a pretty good top speed. It was something like 220, 225 miles per hour, which from that kind of power is really good, especially for a front-wheel drive car. As I said, it was one of the quickest in the game, at least if I recall correctly. It might not have been quite that quick, but I think it was around 220, maybe a little bit more. Now this one is not necessarily going to be quite that quick or quite as dominant as far as front-wheel drive cars go, but it is definitely a dependable one to go for in the game, because the great thing about the RCZ is, and the French actually do this very well when it comes to their lower level coupes and especially their hot hatches, is they manage to keep the driving feel, especially through corners, very light. And what I mean by that is that even when the cars aren't super lightweight, they still in effect feel lightweight, or at least they feel lighter than they actually are. Now that's definitely the case here, because when it's only got just over 150 horsepower to begin with and 176 pound-feet of torque from of course a 1.6 litre engine, turbo aspirated, you can't really afford to have a huge amount of weight that you're lugging around, because that's going to hurt the horsepower per tonne, which is already going to be fairly low given that it's got a low level of power to begin with. And again, you can't really afford for those kind of losses in lower classes, because it's only around N200 to begin with. But the weight is reasonable, even though it is of course a 2+2 decent sized coupe with a decent level of kit, good build quality, especially compared to what would be acceptable sometimes from a car like this in say the 90s for instance. It still only weighs 1,350 kilos. That's pretty good. That's about the same as a GT3 race car in Gran Turismo 6. But of course, they have quite a bit more power, you could say, around 600 in most cases. Now, of course, you can tune this one up. Don't expect it to go quite as high or quite as fast as it did on Gran Turismo 6, but it's no slouch, that's for sure. And I would say that this is one of the cars that actually has benefited from the N-Class system rather than the performance points system from Gran Turismo 6, and it's interesting to see how some cars work better with one and some work better now. And what I mean by that is that this one, for instance, can be detuned to N100, and as long as you drop the weight a little bit as well, or especially if you drop the weight, but even if you don't, it's actually a really good N100 car. Now, it's not necessarily going to beat something like maybe the Honda S660, which is known by many of you guys as well to be very, very good at the N100 level, as we saw from Rivals, a good 4 seconds quicker around Dragon Trail than both of the other K cars in the game. But with this one, of course, you've got a lot more weight. It's a physically larger car, so it's not quite as nimble, but at the same time, it's no slouch. Even with around 150 horsepower, or if you detune it to about 146 to drop the category, it's still quick. It's not fast, but it's quick, if you know what I mean, in a hot hatch kind of way. It's a great kind of rival to stuff like Clios and Renault Twingo Cups, if that were of course in the game, which it isn't, but that sort of thing, because this car feels and acts and performs in a similar way to a hot hatch, but it looks and has the layout of a sports coupe. And I've always liked that combination. It actually kind of allows the car, especially in the real world, to play both camps very well, as I alluded to earlier on, because it allows you to have a very fancy, I would say very pretty appearance, but with the kind of pricing and running costs and practicality of something like a hatchback or a much lower level coupe. Now, in terms of racing, of course, a lot of those things don't apply. It doesn't really matter how practical the car is in a game, you just want to know, can it win races, is it fun to drive? And on that side of things, I would say it's definitely a good one to go for, because for a start, it's very affordable. It's not dirt cheap like a hatchback would be, but 46 grand isn't exactly a huge amount, and the fact that it's a car with this kind of performance that is so low in these kind of N100, N200 or even N300 classes with front wheel drive, it makes the car have a lot of usability. You can use it in coupe settings, front wheel drive settings, low class settings in general, so it's a very versatile coupe to go for. Whereas with something like the TT Quattro, you've already got a lot more power to begin with, it's already all wheel drive, so of course you're not necessarily going to be allowed to use it against hatchbacks. Whereas among that kind of company, this car feels head and shoulders above everything else, because it feels like more than a hot hatch, even though it has the drivetrain layout and, in some cases, the spec of one. And when you combine that reasonable pricing with, I would say, the great looks, definitely the great handling, because the RCZ on Gran Turismo 6 and GT Sport handles really, really well. It's very smooth, very controlled, super beginner friendly, very forgiving, and of course I've mentioned a number of times before, and doubtless will again, that front wheel drive cars just have a chuckability, which typically a rear wheel drive car and some all wheel drive cars, but not most, don't have. And that is because all of your control and performance is essentially coming from the front end. You can throw the car into a corner and it will tend to keep more control and be able to get out of the corner better than a rear-wheel drive car would if you treated it in that same way. Now, that's not to say that a rear-wheel drive car couldn't be quicker. In some circumstances it definitely could be, and so could an all-wheel drive car. It's just that with front-wheel drive, it's kind of the more beginner-friendly approach to doing that. It's a car that you can very quickly, very easily get used to, especially if you're newer to the game. I would recommend trying to get your hands on something like this very quickly, because it allows you to drive quickly, very easily, and you can learn kind of the principles of racing and driving fast in a car like this, and then move on to something bigger and better and faster. But for those of us who are more seasoned with the game or with the franchise or with racing in general, it's still got a ton of use because of how OP it can feel if you detune it. For instance, drop the weight, drop the power a little bit, you've got yourself a really cool N100 sports car. On the other hand, you could tune it up a little bit and use it for high-class front-wheel drive racing. As I said, it's got that versatility, and to me that's what always made the RCZ more appealing to me, combined with the looks. And it's not too surprising that the road car is good, because of course Peugeot, although they don't do high performance that often, they do it very well, and the racing versions and the rally versions of this car in the game are really, really good. So it shouldn't really be surprising that the road car would be as well. Just not quite as exotic as the Group 3 road car. But that's it for this pick overall, certainly worth checking out for low class racing, and that's it for this pick. So of course I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.